Hey there, good people in crypto land. I'm Matt Lysing, and this is my podcast, Decent People. Welcome back to the conversation. Today, I spoke with Paul Brody. He is the global blockchain lead at EY, which used to be Ernst & Young, the consultancy that rebranded a few years ago. We had a great conversation, very wide-ranging about everything that's going on in basically the Ethereum space at this time. I remember meeting Paul years ago in 2019, and he was one of the first kind of corporate allies for everyone. His view was that everyone in the corporate world should be building on the public Ethereum blockchain. And that was not something that was very common to hear back in 2019. We talked about that, especially in light of the fact that he is now the chairman of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which back in the day kind of pushed the idea that some blockchains should be private. That they have opened up that view more now. We spoke about how zero-knowledge proofs are allowing corporations to experiment with public blockchains and get the benefits of scale and decentralization, while also maintaining the privacy that they need. We talked about the Bitcoin ETF and how it's affected the market. We talked about the possibility of an Ethereum ETF. We just talked about a whole bunch of stuff. It was a great conversation. We did have a few technical difficulties, so if you're watching the video version of this, you will notice that Paul changes backgrounds, and I apologize if the video is a little bit erratic or if some of the editing doesn't come off, but hopefully we can stitch that all together. And as always, thanks so much for listening and for supporting us. Hey, Paul, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for coming on, and it's great to see you again. Now, I don't know do you remember when we first met? I was reporting on my book, Out of the Ether. This would have been, I think, 2019. And you were definitely leading the charge at EY. It's Ernst & Young that rebranded a while ago. And I remember being incredibly impressed that you were at this, large, important corporation, and you were leading the charge for using public blockchains, that corporations should be on the public Ethereum blockchain. And that, at this time in 2019, that was a bit of an outlier, would you say, of that opinion?
Absolutely. What we were doing was very controversial. It was really unpopular with a lot of people, even inside our organization, because I think the temptation of a lot of consultants is to, first of all, tell clients what they want to hear, because that gets you to a deal faster. And then secondly, a lot of enterprises really wanted to do private chains because they saw it as a low risk way of getting into the blockchain hype, but without the kind of the fear of like being on this big public, scary network. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to do it, even though the truth is there's kind of no point in running a centralized, decentralized network. And that's something that, it's great maybe as a starting point, but it doesn't sort of have a good, I think, long-term outcome. And
were you the person inside EY making that decision, or was there somebody above you? Or tell me how that came about and why you felt so strongly about that at that point.
So I felt really strongly about it because one of the tough things you have to do in any startup, internal to a large organization or on your own, is you've got to shepherd a very limited budget. You've got to make it count. And so to do that, you have to ask this tough question, okay, where am I going to put my money? Where are we going to be good? If you spread yourself across a bunch of different ecosystems or private networks or public networks, you are dividing out what your opportunity space is. And then it's hard to be really amazing at any one particular thing. But if you look at the ecosystem, the public Ethereum blockchain is the largest blockchain ecosystem out there. Even forget about like public-private. Public Ethereum is the biggest blockchain ecosystem. So if you have a limited budget, I think the smart thing to do is to make sure that you are the best in the biggest ecosystem. And so in many ways, it kind of boils down to that.
Yeah, I hear you 100% on the startup budget issue with with Decential. That is a struggle that we are going through every week. But there are risks here, right? The risks were that, as you mentioned, sort of alluded to, if you're a public corporation and you are putting information publicly out onto a blockchain, you expose yourself to some risks, right? And that is something that I think most corporations don't like to take risks.
You're right. Most companies don't want to take risk, and they get fairly nervous about it. The best argument in favor, for example, of working on a private blockchain is that it's a path eventually to getting to public. It gives you a chance to dip your toes into a technology without as much risk. That's one philosophical approach. I've tried to encourage our clients to take a slightly different risk management approach, which is, if you think about it, there's two paths. On path one, if you go down the private blockchain path, the other people in your private blockchain will be people you know, companies you know, and it's low risk in that respect. But it's not it's not kind of the whole public ecosystem. So you're limited in your capital and your access and things like that. But you can do really complex things because you can trust the other participants. Mm-hmm. On a public blockchain, you can't trust the other participants and you don't know who else is out there. So your choice there, if you want to dip your toes in very carefully, is to very, very carefully limit what it is that you are doing. So sort of path A, do really sophisticated stuff, but in an extremely controlled environment. Or path B, do a very limited amount of stuff in a very public and chaotic environment. It's not as much fun, or maybe doesn't seem as cool to do a limited amount of stuff, like just do one small thing. But in the end, I think actually in many ways, it can be slightly better for some of the companies involved.
Do you think that trade-off hurt the permissioned blockchain space? Because I remember thinking back then that I thought, I bet one of the big breakouts is going to come from one of these permissioned systems where everyone knows each other. And then maybe it's a bunch of banks and maybe some of their clients. And they can all kind of see what the efficiency gains are and how, the settlement times can go down almost to zero. But as far as I know, that never happened. And I'm curious if you think, did that never happen on the private side? And then was it that limiting factor on the public side where you can just do little things that might not, kind of move the needle much or get you, a great performance review from your boss about what you're doing on the public Ethereum chain? There
were actually quite a few good successes in the private blockchain environment in terms of proving out the concept and generating sort of decent internal returns. JP Morgan Chase is a really good example. They have Onyx. It does some of the things you talk about, really fast settlement times, several global banks are part of it, potentially large volumes.
They're doing their repo trades on that network, right?
I believe so, yes. I don't know who the other partners are, but they have a number of sort of applications up in this Onyx environment. We had a very good experience with Microsoft. We built a smart contract system, and even though we couldn't expose it externally because of the privacy restrictions, we were able to cut the cycle time for contract management at Microsoft by 99%. And the operating cost by 40%. Okay. So we were able to prove some useful things out, but we, at least in our case with Microsoft, couldn't scale it up because without sort of zero knowledge-based privacy, you can't easily expose it to the outside world. And if it's not on the public network, it's hard to convince other companies, especially rivals, to join in your ecosystem. So private blockchains worked out as a nice proving ground, but they really had a hard time scaling up.
So that makes me wonder, on the one side, you're saying you've got these small transactions you can do on a public blockchain or more complicated, intense transactions on a private chain. And I wonder, do you think that had an effect on maybe limiting what could be done on a private chain versus a public chain? Because I remember thinking that private chains would maybe, have some sort of breakthrough, and maybe you'd have a bunch of banks and maybe their customers would be on that chain. And that once everybody could realize the efficiency gains and just that it worked, that might be kind of a proof of concept to get people to be more interested and maybe go to the public chain.
I think you're sort of right. So there's definitely some very successful cases. A really good example is, JP Morgan Chase has had a lot of success with the Onyx and some of the work they're doing there. They've got other banks on it. They've got a few other banks on it. They're doing transactions. They're demonstrating kind of reduced cycle times. We had a very similar experience with Microsoft. We were able to cut our cycle time with Microsoft, by 99%. So from 45 days down to like a couple minutes. And we were able to cut the system costs for the Xbox for like the procurement process by 40%.
Can I just jump in? What's a cycle time?
Cycle time just means like the amount of time. So in the case of Microsoft, the way things were working was they would sell video games to the Xbox network, and they had 3,000 different clients. And at the end of each month, they would have slightly different terms and conditions for each of their clients. And so they would have to do this like semi-automated process. It took about 40 days where they sort of said, okay, here's the volume we had, and then here we are applying the rules for each contract.
Okay. We
turned all those contracts into Ethereum smart contracts, and we put them on a private blockchain. And so you could accommodate an infinite variety of specific terms and conditions. And that was... Sorry about that. That was some kind of smart speaker going on.
Speaking of smart contracts,
you can accommodate basically an infinite variety of different kind of terms and conditions and do it automatically. So that whole process, which used to take 45 days, now takes about 2 minutes.
Wow, that's amazing.
So that's a huge improvement in a process. The big downside is private blockchains are great at proving the value proposition. They're not something that lots of other companies feel comfortable joining. And so they tend to founder in the scaling up process. They don't fail in the proof the technology can work. They fail in the, can we scale this up? Do other people really want to join this centralized infrastructure? Because if they wanted to join centralized infrastructure, there's already so many centralized options.
Yeah. And I bet it must be hard to, prove to those other competitors that this is working because it's a closed network, right? And so you can't just say, "Hey, man, this works." They don't get to see it with their own eyes, I guess.
You can't really show it to them because you'd be exposing so much confidential data. I think something that did happen with a lot of private blockchains was everybody thought, "Oh, if it's a private blockchain, it must have privacy." And I think people, when they really got into it, when they discovered that yes, that people outside the blockchain can't see what you're doing, but everybody inside the chain can. And therefore, your competition can see everything that you're doing. And that's not really desirable. So I think both private and public blockchains suffered from this lack of confidentiality. And the private ones maybe more so just because people thought there was privacy inherent in the name private blockchain, and there isn't.
Yeah, definitely a different definition of private there. Well, that's a great segue to what you told me a few months ago when we talked about, we'll get into this, but we were talking about how AI and blockchain can interact. But you mentioned a little bit offhand that you're excited that some of your corporate clients are using zero knowledge proofs to interact with the public blockchain so that they can do more interesting and, maybe complicated transactions in a public sphere, but using zero knowledge proofs to shield what they're doing. So they're not giving away trade secrets. They're not giving away customer data. Can you tell me more about that? Because I found that really fascinating.
Yeah. So to me, this is the magic piece of the puzzle that completely changes all the things that you can do with blockchain on public or private networks. Doesn't matter. The big thing that's holding back enterprise users is they might love the idea of decentralized systems. They might love kind of the power of tokenization. They might love the immutability that you get on a public blockchain, but they're all very, very sensitive to disclosing confidential business information. So the ability to do things on a public chain with privacy is hugely important. And there's basically kind of two things that have to be done. If you think about any business agreement, it comes down to this. I got money, you got stuff, and we're exchanging my money for your stuff under the terms of some kind of agreement. And so there's two things that you have to do to make privacy work on chain. Item number one, you've got to make the money and the stuff tokenized and private. And for that, we built a system called Nightfall. Nightfall is a zero knowledge proof based L3 for blockchains, for EVM blockchains. And it's currently running, the Nightfall 3 version is running on the Polygon proof of stake network. And we are getting ready to take the wraps off of Nightfall 4, which will be just a sort of an incremental improvement. But basically you can do private tokenization transfers between entities in that environment. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, for the agreement part, we built a compiler called Starlight. And what Starlight does is it lets you take an EVM compatible Solidity smart contract and turn it into a zero knowledge circuit. So you can actually run business logic, not just move stuff around. So if you think about it, there's the money and the stuff, and then there's the business agreement. Now we can do both of those. And we have our first clients testing out a smart contract running as a zero knowledge circuit on public Ethereum right now.
So without giving away details, can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on here and what you're talking about?
I'm really excited because we picked a really interesting, we had a client that really wanted to do something interesting. There are these whole complex agreements called power purchase agreements. And what happens is large companies agree to buy certain quantities of renewable electricity at a set price. And then what they do is they actually buy the electricity on the open market at the market price. And then they have like a true up process with the supplier at the end of a month or at the end of a quarter that sets everything up. And so there's a whole bunch of like complicated rules about you have to buy a certain amount and this is the minimum price and that's the maximum price kind of a thing. And we have turned that complex agreement into a blockchain-based zero-knowledge circuit. And what our client is able to do is fully automate all the rules of this agreement on the public Ethereum blockchain. So we're prototyping that now. We have a client that's using it. And the goal is to be able to deploy this generally available to any company that's engaged in a power purchasing agreement.
So I'm noticing a parallel here with your Microsoft example before, where you're taking a very complicated set of processes, but then with a smart contract in this new version, it seems to be becoming much more simple. Is that too easy to say?
No, you're really zeroing in on kind of an issue that we've identified with a lot of large, like really high volume centralized systems. Centralized systems do a fantastic job of handling very, very large volumes of transactions, but not a lot of complexity. And what seems to work really well for blockchains is with smart contracts, you can basically have almost infinite set of rules. And although your sort of gas cost, effectively your CPU compute cost is higher because you're handling more complex logic, it still works out to be much, much faster and cheaper to take a complex business agreement and put it into a smart contract than it is to try to adapt these older legacy centralized systems to handle a lot of complex variation. And so this is where I think we're going to find a real sweet spot for blockchain technology in the enterprise, is handling sort of complex business rules in a very scalable and simple way.
So that brings to mind immediately, I remember thinking, I think Maersk was the one who got involved with a pilot for supply chain and using blockchain for supply chain, because there are, I don't know, hundreds, sometimes thousands, right, of companies who are supplying, like, maybe Maersk is not the right example, but a company like Toyota or somebody, a car manufacturer, that has to get rubber here and parts from here and steel and all that glass and all that stuff. Has that ever, do you see that working? Did that ever kind of bear out, or was that just too many parts to get into one kind of cohesive system?
It is on our strategic roadmap. Like when I think about where we need to go, what I want us to be able to do, right now, we can do well two things separately. We can either tokenize stuff and move it around, or we can program a complex business smart contract. Mm-hmm. We haven't yet built the tools that allow us to easily do both under a high level of privacy at scale with extremely low cost. So we're not quite there. People have to remember this technology is, relatively speaking, a little bit on the immature side. And so we're trying to pick off individual case examples right now where we know we can do it well at a relatively low cost. But that is where we want to go. So right now, for example, with Nightfall 3, you can get to, on the Polygon Proof of Stake network, about 1 penny per token per transaction. And that, you might think to yourself, oh, that's really cheap. I can do that. But what you have to remember, and you know, cars are a really good example, right? A traditional car, like a gasoline car, has several thousand parts, and each of those parts moves half a dozen times from initial manufacturing to end customer. And not only that, but you have to remember each of those parts is actually an NFT. It's a non-fungible token. So you can't move them easily in sort of batches the way you can move like a bunch of ERC20s. And the net result is that you're talking about potentially tens of millions of transactions. If you're like a really big car maker, to get everything on the supply chain, you're talking about tens of millions of transactions a day. So the gas fees of that, even on an L2, end up being relatively high, too high to justify that immediately. So my view is right now we can do somewhat higher value supply chains that have lower volumes of stuff. Our end state goal, when we think about the roadmap for Ethereum, if we can drop the cost of gas by another order of magnitude from instead of 1 cent per transaction to 1/10 of a cent per transaction, we will be at the point where basically we can put any complex supply chain on the blockchain. So what you're describing, that's where I want to go. We're just going to have to get there one step at a time.
Fair enough. Okay. So now I was going to kind of give you a hard time here about something, but I, during our conversation, I think I've figured it out, and just bear with me, because just about a month ago, you told me in a story I wrote for Decential, the quote, "There is no circumstance when a permissioned blockchain is a good idea," end quote. But you are now the chairman, the new chairman as of last month of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is all about permissioned and private blockchains. It's been around since 2017. It had founding members that included JP Morgan, British Petroleum, Microsoft, IBM, ING. But now I think, and I was going to be like, what are you talking about, Paul? How can you kind of go to the dark side? But I think what I'm hearing from you, and tell me if I'm right, is that you want to use these ZK snark, proofs and in concert with companies going to public blockchains that now has much more privacy, and then you've got the scale of the Ethereum mainnet underneath it, so that you get kind of the best of both worlds. Am I onto something there?
So you are, but I'll just straight up honestly tell you, like when I agreed to take the job as a chairman of the EEA, I agreed also to be a little bit more diplomatic in my discussions about private blockchains. And so
I got you right before you agreed to that, I guess.
You did. And I want to operate with a very high level of integrity. Like I cannot, if I put my EY hat on, I would never tell a client, I think you should build on a private blockchain. However, I have to respect the decisions that other people are making to build on private blockchains. We have built stuff on private blockchains. We've always tried to do it with the outcome that we want to get to public. So, and that remains my goal. The EEA, to be fair to them, though, is not all about private blockchains or permission chains. The EEA is all about enterprise users, business users of the Ethereum ecosystem. And so I think of like my job as the chairman to serve all of those users on private or public chains. If you are an Ethereum ecosystem member, the EEA should be serving you. And so I have to take that kind of responsibility very seriously. Yeah. But I do think that in general, over time, people are migrating to public, and I will not just change my tune, but I have agreed to be more thoughtful and diplomatic and less maybe provocative in the way I talk about it.
That's fair. And like you said before, I think for some companies, some corporations, this is sort of like a sandbox, right? Like a private chain, a permissioned chain could be where they get to test things out and see if they like it. And that could be a step, like you said, towards using a public chain at some point in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't think when we last spoke that the Bitcoin ETF had been approved. So I was curious what your thoughts are on that and how it's affecting the overall ecosystem, because we did definitely talk about, you were saying there's so much institutional capital that's on the sidelines still because of regulatory uncertainty that just it's been barred from entering the space. But obviously this is the first kind of foray for institutional capital through the Bitcoin ETF. So I'm just curious how you've seen it developing. What, just for listeners, the stat that I love is that the BlackRock ETF went to $10 billion under management faster than any other ETF in history. So there's obviously this giant demand for it out there. And how have you, what's your take on everything so far with that?
You and I probably have the same point of view in that respect, right? I think there's enormous amount of pent up demand. Right now, every single ultra high net worth family office in the world has allocated some tiny amount to cryptocurrency and digital assets. They're all kind of playing in that sandbox. And a lot of institutional investors are basically barred from doing that because they don't have a sort of regulated institutional access point. A Bitcoin ETF, and eventually what I hope will be an Ethereum ETF, will provide that pathway. And so particularly in the US, which doesn't have an equivalent of the MiCA law that the EU has, a markets and crypto assets law. In the US market, the ETFs are a very important channel for all that institutional interest.
Yeah.
Where I think this is all going is over the next 30 to 40 years. And it is important to really take a timeline view that's like decades. Over the next 30 to 40 years, cryptocurrency and I think even more importantly, digital tokenized assets are going to become a standard part of every like institutional pension fund and other kind of portfolio. And in that context, it's all going to go regulated. It's all going to go to those kind of firms and entities that are onshore in the country. And it's this gradual transition to a regulated market is going to completely transform the crypto and blockchain marketplace.
So you mentioned the Ethereum ETF there. And so if we took Gary Gensler out of the equation, he's the chairman of the SEC. The reason that the Bitcoin ETF was approved was because a court said that, look, you guys approved an ETF based on Bitcoin futures. And using that same process, it doesn't make any sense that you would deny an ETF based on spot Bitcoin. So there is an ETF based on Ethereum futures at this point. So, I mean, it seems to me that the same situation applies here to Ethereum, but there is some pretty high level resistance to it at the SEC. If we took that out of the equation, do you think that an Ethereum ETF is sort of, the next thing that we're going to see?
I really hope that we will see an Ethereum ETF, and I hope we will see it soon. I never want to, sort of speculate on kind of what's going on inside the regulatory infrastructure. We have a fairly complex regulatory structure in the US, and when it does kind of eventually converge, I think it works reasonably well, but I think it's hard to beat what the EU has done at the moment to this MiCA law, this markets and crypto assets law. It's just a real excellent benchmark. It's not perfect by any means, and I've certainly heard people complain about it, but in general, it's really great because it lays out the groundwork and it makes it easy for people to know what they can and cannot do and how they can enter things. And it basically provides a legal framework for every kind of like digital and crypto asset. So, we see this very clearly in our business. Our European work is way up. This year actually will be the first year in the history of EY blockchain where the EU has been our largest market.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, there's nothing that people love more than regulatory clarity, right? I've heard it from so many people. They want to obey the rules. They just don't know what the rules are. And that's what's so frustrating. So here in the US, that would mean congressional action. Are you optimistic on that? Do you think they're ready for writing laws about digital assets? Is there more education needed, or where do you think we are in that sort of arena?
I've listened to sort of congressional leaders who from both sides of the aisle who said some pretty thoughtful and constructive things. I've read a whole bunch of draft bills. I just don't know enough about our congressional ecosystem to speculate as to whether or not they have a chance of passing, especially kind of in the run up to an election. My observation or my preference would be that blockchain and crypto not become this intensely partisan issue. My one observation is like when things become super partisan, nothing happens, right? You have gridlock. Whereas I do know like Congress and the Senate, they do pass legislation that's more low key, right? It's almost like you're much better off if the public's not paying too much attention to it and it's not a political hot potato. Yeah. So the thing that stresses me out is when people take some kind of very strong partisan view about whether blockchain or crypto is good or bad. And one of the things that matters a lot to me is that, yes, there are a ton of bad actors in this ecosystem. It's super important to me that regulators go after the bad actors because bad actors really are damaging the whole perception of the industry, across the public. And if the public doesn't think the industry is honest, it doesn't think the industry adds any value, that's eventually going to make its way into how politicians who are really trying to serve the public interest, right? It's going to poison the well for everybody. So, I've been really happy to see. You can disagree or love or hate like a lot of the regulatory actions, but the prosecutions of bad actors have been very important because they give the industry a chance. It's really hard if you're an honest player to compete with somebody who's fundamentally not even bothering to buy the crypto you think that they're supposed to buy for you. Yeah. So, I want it to be a non-political issue. I want the industry to clean up its act, and then we can. I think our odds of getting constructive legislation passed are much, much higher.
Yeah, I love hearing you say that. And I don't quite understand the political, polarization either, because it certainly doesn't help to have some senators, saying that they're raising an army to go kill crypto. And because I feel like on the Democratic side, at least, the promise of crypto and Web3 is that you're giving more power back to individuals. You're taking away some of the middlemen status of very big gatekeeping companies that, are being sued by the DOJ, for example, like Apple and Google, and you're putting more power into the hands of individuals, which I always thought that was something that the Democrats stood for. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me why they've gotten so ingrained in that sort of anti-cryptocurrency stance. But I wondered too, just to stay on this one last question. There were some reports a few weeks ago that the SEC might be looking at Ethereum as a security again because it changed to proof of stake back a few years ago. Apparently from those stories, the thinking is that this gives the SEC a new opportunity to take a look at Ethereum because now it's got a different mechanism that's securing the network, and people are pledging a certain amount of Ether as collateral to be a validator. And maybe this is me thinking it is that, okay, if you're pledging collateral and you're earning interest on it, they might think that, oh, wow, that kind of looks like it's a security. So, not to put you on the spot too much, but what do you think about that?
I saw the same articles you did. I read the same things. I read the same logic, but no one in authority has actually said anything officially one way or the other. And I think back to like the Bitcoin ETF, right? All the rumors that swirled before the approval of the Bitcoin ETF, right? I just, in the absence of any factual data, like there's an endless supply of speculation, but I don't feel like any of it's especially well informed. So I haven't lost any sleep over that kind of point of view.
Okay, fair enough. And let me just bounce off you my personal opinion that I've been formulating recently. That I feel like Ether is a currency. It is the underlying native currency of the Ethereum ecosystem. It's what everyone must use to transact. It's what you pay gas with. It is basically no different, in my opinion, to the US dollar and to the global economy that's based around the US dollar as a currency. And so obviously the US dollar is not a security. I don't quite get it why Ethereum would be seen as a security. I can have dollars in my bank account and my bank will pay me interest on that. I can have Ethereum in my wallet or at a staking service and I'll get paid interest on that. Am I missing anything there, or am I being too simplistic, do you think?
It's a really tough analogy. So I like part of your analogy here, right? So Ether is the base currency of the Ethereum ecosystem in the same way that the dollar is the base currency of the US economy. Mm-hmm. And the dollar strength comes from the fact that, there is a really, really large set of products and services that you can buy that are dollar denominated, and a whole kind of legal and regulatory infrastructure that supports that kind of commercial ecosystem. And Ethereum is a mini version of the same thing with a lot of similarities. However, you can't stake dollars the way you can stake Ether, for example. So it's not exactly the same. You can use your dollars to buy government bonds, and you might argue that is a somewhat a similar thing. But fundamentally, kind of nation states are so very different. Paul Krugman, who was one of my professors at Princeton and is now a New York Times economist, he once described the U.S. government as an insurance company with an army. And he was talking about the fact that at the end of the day, like the vast majority of our taxes really basically go to pay for like healthcare and retirement savings. And we have like a military on the side. And that's like 90% of all the stuff that the government does. And Ethereum's not quite like that. I think the analogy, it's sometimes kind of risky to make too much of an analogy. One of the other things that I take away, a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying like, oh, a cryptocurrency is going to replace fiat currencies. I think for sure the answer is no. So cryptocurrencies are useful for paying for, like in the Ethereum case, you want to pay gas fees with it. But other than that, what you really notice is that most people prefer to transact using tokenized US dollars. I think stablecoins are extremely important. And I think stablecoins have become kind of the de facto environment, certainly for business users. If you're an enterprise, your revenues are in dollars, your taxes are in dollars, you're paying your employees in dollars. You want to transact on chain in dollars because you don't want to take kind of financial foreign exchange risk. And the analogy I often use is, it's been legal forever, maybe not forever, but for a very long time as an American citizen, I can hold Swiss francs, I can own gold, but I would never walk into a coffee shop and they'd be like, I want to buy a cup of coffee. Can I pay for it with some gold? Like, that's not going to happen. And I think the dollar is a really, really effective and efficient kind of mechanism of payment. But I do think that there is a division of labor that's starting to mature. If you really want a true crypto asset, something that's not linked to a nation state economy, Bitcoin has carved out that role. Like it's there, it's going to be extremely dominant. If you want a programmable business transaction ecosystem, you're going to go do it on Ethereum. And Ether is going to be kind of the foundational kind of payment mechanism, and probably US dollars are going to be the preferred currency for most business transactions in that environment.
I don't know why it took me so long, but I think it has dawned on me that when if people are still saying there's no killer app in crypto, it's like, no, there's the stablecoin is the killer app. I think that's it. And this is definitely not something that I've come up with, but I've just heard enough people say it recently that it sunk in. So, okay. And then another thing that you guys are working on that we talked about recently for the story I wrote on Decential was the intersection of artificial intelligence and blockchain, and how blockchain has a capacity here to help kind of, you use the analogy of garbage in, garbage out. So an artificial intelligence system has to be drawing from something, some database, some large language model. That's what it's, that's how it's coming back to you with the information that it's going to give you. There's a lot of crap out there on the internet, of course. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of outright lies. But your point of view here is that blockchain, with its ability to verify information, could give AI models more authority, maybe more they could be verifiable. Can you just? And I know, as you said in the story, it's early here, but I've heard this from a lot of people. I had the Ritual co-founder Sunil Srini on just the show a couple weeks ago. There's this news about the ASI token, which is the Singularity Net, Fetch.ai, and the Ocean Protocol are all combining to try to decentralize AI systems. So, and there's a lot of other stuff out there. So this is obviously top of mind for a lot of people. Tell me about your take and where you think this is headed.
There are so many kind of cool things that are happening all at once in AI. And I'm going to sort of preface my comments by just saying, it's hard enough keeping track of what's going on in the world of blockchain. Never mind sort of keeping track of what's going on in the world of AI. I do my best. I sit with my colleagues who spend time on AI, and we talk about this a lot. I'm incredibly excited about the cool stuff that's going on in AI. And I see quite a few places where there will be potential for a really good intersection. One of them is in this whole area of decentralized compute and infrastructure, AI systems require mind-boggling levels of compute power to be trained and to work. And today, building a data center is great, costs hundreds of millions of dollars, but actually we are sitting on piles of compute power that are relatively underutilized in decentralized infrastructure. So if we can figure out how to make your home PC, idle office computers, GPUs in cars, and smart electric vehicles, if we can figure out how to put those to work at scale in the decentralized infrastructure, it is potentially really powerful in terms of creating a whole new infrastructure model. Secondly, you alluded to it right away at the beginning, right? How do we know what is high quality data and what isn't? Mm-hmm. How do we know what's been created by really smart human experts who are very thoughtful? And how do we know what somebody just spewed out on their blog? And how do we even know what was written by, an AI and somebody pretended it was generated by a human? Right? I think I don't really have a lot of expert data points yet, but I think this garbage in, garbage out issue is going to be a really big one. If you train an AI on low quality information, it will give you low quality answers. And you can really see this if you go to like any of the big sort of large language models and you ask them about how blockchains work, or you ask them about the pros and cons of private and public blockchains, you will get back a kind of a composite answer that reflects the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom about many things is often wrong. Right. And I think particularly, and it shifts over time as we become more expert. If you ask almost anybody except for me 4 or 5 years ago, like, are private blockchains really great for corporations? Are they going to be successful? Or you asked another question like, hey, are we going to live in a multi-chain world? The conventional wisdom was we're going to live in a multi-chain world, and many of these blockchains, or most of them maybe, are going to be private blockchains for enterprise users. Mm-hmm. If you were to ask, the top industry analysts today how they see that, they would say, they're probably leaning more towards saying we're going to live in an Ethereum world where there'll be many different L2s for programmability. And most of them, if not all of them, will be kind of essentially public chains. So conventional wisdom isn't always right, and it migrates over time. Whereas I think if you'd ask really technology experts, you might have actually come up with some quite different views. So being able to understand what the origin is and really sort of train models or do your analysis on authoritative information could be quite transformational. And then, of course, AI is amazing for analysis. And I think being able to use AIs to analyze data that comes off on chain is going to be incredibly useful. We're already starting to see a whole bunch of startups in that space. And then we're seeing people speculate about having AIs write like smart contracts. Certainly, we are already using AI-based programming tools to help develop smart contracts, but we're not quite at the point yet where I would just let an AI system develop a smart contract and deploy it.
Okay. Well, that was very good, Paul. You were very diplomatic there. You didn't, so I'm glad to hear it. And then, okay. And I had something else to ask, but I think I've forgotten. But yeah, so this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for all your knowledge. I love how wide ranging you are and the experience you have in the space, and for sharing all that with me. If folks want to learn more about UI and what you guys are doing, or Nightfall, tell them how to keep up with what's going on.
Yeah, so maybe sort of a couple parting kind of messages. Number one, I'll say it again. I wrote a book. It's called Ethereum for Business, and it kind of lays out the whole vision I have. And it's the key thing about this book is it's all written in plain English, and all the royalties go to Gitcoin. So you can buy the book either in print, electronically, or as an audiobook. I get nothing. It's my kind of contribution to the ecosystem. I'm very happy that way. I wanted to make something that was accessible and readable about kind of why and how you should do business on Ethereum. Number two, now that I've been newly named the chairman of the Enterprise Ethereum Association, I really want to love and ask everybody to please rejoin the Enterprise Ethereum Association, right? We had a lot of companies that left during the kind of crypto bust, right? The crypto winter, everybody got their budget squeezed. Now that we're coming out of the winter, please re-sign up, or if you haven't joined before, you're a new company, please come and help the business world of Ethereum speak with one voice. And then lastly, if you want to know about what EY is doing, and I love to talk about it, 2 places to go look. First of all, blockchain.ey.com, which is our main website. It's where you can find out what we're doing. You can sign up for updates and join our global summit, which we stream online. And then secondly, you can, if you want to look into our open source technology, which is Nightfall for privacy and Starlight for privacy, both of those are public domain, open source contributions, primarily, but not exclusively built by EY. And they're at github.com/EY blockchain. And you can use them free of charge, no license fee, no gotchas in the licensing model, nothing. It's available for everybody to use in however they'd like to.
That's amazing. And I think, as you mentioned, it seems now with everything that we talked about here over the last hour that corporations should be getting back involved, because it seems like there's a lot of really interesting stuff right on the cusp here, and you don't want to miss out. And then you mentioned your global conference. I believe that's coming up later this month. Is that right?
April 16th to 18th. It's in London. It's streamed live online, and it starts in London about 1 p.m. every day, which is about, I think it's about 7 or 8 a.m. Eastern, and about 4 or 5 p.m. in the Gulf.
Okay. Well, again, Paul, thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking to you, and good luck with everything. And hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us, and make sure to subscribe and rate us at Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Decent People is a production of Decential Media. It is produced by Curtis Fritsch, with music by Brian Duncan and Kareem Imes.